When we walk the cobblestone streets of Charleston, South Carolina today, we are surrounded by a carefully curated nostalgia. We see the pastel mansions, the swaying palmettos, and the monuments to the Old South. We are taught that this city was built on rice, indigo, and cotton, cultivated by the tragic labor of enslaved Africans. This is the history we know. It is the history that has been written in textbooks and immortalized in film. But beneath the foundations of those historic homes lies a darker, largely forgotten chapter, a history that predates the cotton gin and the rice fields. Before South Carolina was the capital of the African slave trade, it was the epicenter of something else. A massive, brutal, and highly organized trade in Indigenous Americans. For nearly 50 years, from the founding of Charlestown in 1670 until the explosive violence of 1715, the English colony's most lucrative export was not crops, but people. It is a hidden history that challenges everything we think we know about the origins of the American South. To understand the true cost of colonization, we must look back to a time when the wilderness was a marketplace and the currency was human flesh. To understand how this began, we have to transport ourselves back to 1670. A small group of English settlers, many arriving from the overcrowded sugar island of Barbados, landed on the banks of the Ashley River. They named their settlement Charlestown. It was a precarious existence. The environment was hostile, the swamps were fever-ridden, and the Spanish in Florida were a constant threat. These early settlers were desperate for profit. They tried silk, they tried wine, they tried olives. All failed, but they found two things in abundance in the vast pine forests surrounding them: white-tailed deer and Native American tribes. Almost immediately, a chilling economic system emerged. We call it the gun-slave cycle. It was a trap, simple in its design and devastating in its effect. The English traders offered modern weaponry, muskets, powder, and steel axes, to certain local tribes. In a region where warfare was endemic, possessing a musket wasn't just a luxury. It was a matter of survival. But the English didn't want gold for these guns. They wanted labor. Specifically, they wanted captives from rival tribes. If a tribe wanted to survive, they had to trade. To trade, they had to raid. The Westo tribe, a group originally from the north who were armed with guns, became the colony's first primary partners. They terrorized the Spanish missions in Georgia and Florida, bringing lines of bound captives back to Charlestown. But who were the men driving this trade? They were known as the Goose Creek Men. These were not pious pilgrims seeking religious freedom. They were hardened opportunists, mostly Anglican dissenters from Barbados who understood the brutal math of plantation slavery. They often ignored the laws set down by the Lords Proprietors back in London, who technically forbade the enslavement of friendly Indians. The Goose Creek Men didn't care about London laws. They cared about profit. They realized that while deerskins provided a steady income, a human being could be sold for a massive return. But here is where the story takes a turn that surprises many. We often assume these indigenous slaves were kept on local farms. While some were, the vast majority were not. The English settlers quickly learned that enslaving a man in his own homeland was dangerous. He knew the terrain. He could escape. He could return with warriors. So Charlestown became an export hub. Native American men, women, and children were marched in chains to the docks and loaded onto ships. Their destination was the Caribbean, Jamaica, Barbados, and Nevis, or the northern colonies like Massachusetts and Pennsylvania. In the sugar fields of the West Indies, they replaced the African populations that were dying at horrific rates. The scale of this operation was staggering. Historians estimate that between 1670 and 1715, anywhere from 30,000 to 50,000 Native Americans were enslaved and exported from South Carolina. To put that in perspective, during the early decades of the colony, more indigenous slaves were exported out of Charlestown than African slaves were imported into it. For a time, the primary capital flowing into the colony came from the sale of Native Americans. As the years dragged on, the hunger for slaves grew insatiable. The trade routes stretched longer, reaching deep into the interior, affecting the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, and the Creek nations, reaching as far as the Mississippi River. The entire Southeast became a hunting ground. When the Westo tribe became too powerful and difficult to control, the English simply turned on them, destroyed them, and found new partners in the savannas and the Yamasee. This brings us to the Yamasee. By the early 1700s, the Yamasee were the indispensable allies of South Carolina. They were the buffer against the Spanish and the primary slave catchers for the English. But the relationship was rotting from the inside. By 1711, the deer population was dwindling from overhunting. The Yamasee could no longer pay their debts to the white traders with skins. The traders, ruthless and unregulated, began seizing the wives and children of the Yamasee warriors as payment for these debts. They cheated the tribes in trade, beat them, and treated them with open contempt. The diplomatic balance that had kept the colony alive was crumbling. The English, blinded by arrogance, thought they had the upper hand. They believed the tribes were too dependent on English gunpowder to ever revolt. They were wrong. On Good Friday, April 15, 1715, the bill came due. It began at the town of Pocatello. A delegation of British traders had gone there to smooth over tensions, but they were seized and killed. The Yamasee War had begun. This was not a minor skirmish. It was a coordinated, multi-tribal coalition that included the Creeks, the Catawba, and others, all intent on wiping the South Carolina colony off the map. The violence was total. Plantations were burned to the ground. Traders were cut down in the woods. Refugees flooded into Charleston, huddled within the city walls as smoke rose from the horizon. The colony stood on the absolute brink of destruction. It is estimated that 7% of the white population of South Carolina was killed, a casualty rate rarely seen in American history. The colony survived, but only by the skin of its teeth, and largely because they managed to bribe the Cherokee to enter the war on their side, breaking the tribal alliance. The Yamasee War of 1715 changed everything. It effectively ended the Indian slave trade on a commercial scale. The English realized that the business was simply too dangerous. The instability it caused, the wars, the shifting alliances, the constant threat of annihilation, was bad for business. And so a pivotal shift occurred. The planters of South Carolina turned their eyes away from the American interior and looked across the ocean. They decided that African slavery was a safer investment. Africans were far from home, they had no local allies to rescue them, and the supply chain, though horrific, was managed by the British Royal African Company, not volatile frontier politics. After 1715, the import of enslaved Africans skyrocketed. The rice culture boomed, and the plantation system that we associate with the Old South solidified. But what happened to the thousands of indigenous people who had already been enslaved? This is perhaps the final tragedy of the story. They didn't just vanish. They were absorbed. In the tax records and censuses of the 18th and 19th centuries, the classification of Indian began to disappear. They were reclassified as black or mulatto. The distinct identity of thousands of people was legally erased, hidden within the broader tragedy of African chattel slavery. The Indian slave trade of Charleston is a ghost story. It haunts the lineage of millions of Americans who may not realize they have indigenous ancestors who were shipped to the Caribbean or forced into local servitude. It challenges the simplified narrative of a white and black South, revealing a triracial history of blood, commerce, and survival. When we look at the beautiful, preserved architecture of Charleston today, we must remember that the initial capital used to build this colony wasn't generated by the soil, but by the systemic theft of the people who lived on it. It is a harsh truth, but history does not exist to make us comfortable. It exists to make us remember. And this chapter, hidden for so long in the shadows of the palmetto trees, demands to be known.